Now I can see that the meeting is now online and on YouTube too. So I think that's a good point to start. We are about 50 participants now. Hopefully some more will join, but we can't wait for that for all the time. So let me give you a very warm welcome from Tübingen University. My name is Jörg Strübing. I'm one of a larger group of organizers of this traditional, we may say, traditional event, the summer school on qualitative writing in social sciences. And I won't make many words here, just to say hello to the organizing team, say hello to our instructors who are already, some of them who have already shown up, Monika Wohlrab-Saar, Almut Peukert is already there, Katrin Girgensson is there, Ursula herself is among the organizers and the instructor team, and then Kathy will join later on for her session only and not for this talk. Okay, so again, we are in this online format. We are a bit used to it meanwhile. Anyway, we would love to have it done in presence, and we will do next year. I'm pretty sure we will do. I'm among the optimists. Others are on the pessimist side. I know my team. But anyway, I think we will do. Especially I would welcome poor Pacheco-Vega, who will be on our keynote speaker. And he will be introduced later on by Claire Bullen. But let me maybe briefly introduce our organizing team. So I mentioned Ursula Offenberger. There's also Claire Bullen present. There's Barbara Stauber from Educational Sciences. And most of all, there's Sophia Gieser, with whom most of you have already had contact. She's the one who sent all the emails out and who took your money in and whatsoever. So she's the one person without whom it would never have happened today. So that's for us, for me, and I hand over to Ursula, who wants to say something for the Method Center, who's co-organizing this event.
Yes, just also a very brief and warm welcome from my side, and we are very happy to be able to organize the school again. And I think we have doing it online, and we are glad that it is possible to do it online somehow. And of course, we all have the wish to welcome you back in our nice facilities in Tübingen, the Alte Aula, historical rooms and everything. But you can guess what is one of our discussion points in the organizing team, whether the hygiene concepts that the University of Tübingen requires allows us to do this, because we all do this kind of beyond everything else what we do. Yeah, I'm located in the Method Center, which was founded in the Faculty of Social Sciences last year. And the Method Center is part of the excellence strategy of the university, and is also the generous founder of the schools. So apart from your costs that you carry, the Method Center pays for the facility. So we are very happy to do this as an interdisciplinary setting together with the Institute of Education and also Sociology. So that was it from my side, and I think I hand over to Claire. Was it that, or was it Sophia? I don't know.
Sophia, I think Sophia.
Sophia, yeah.
I think it was me. So just really briefly, also warmly welcome from my side. As Jörg already mentioned, I'm kind of the organizational background of the school. So if you have any issues or questions, just drop me an email and me, myself, or someone from the team will answer. So yeah, have fun, have good conversations, and yeah, we'll see each other, I guess, at the plenary session.
All right, Claire.
Okay, welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Welcome to our course, our workshop participants. Welcome to all the participants who are joining us here on YouTube, and welcome also to those who are able to join us on YouTube Live. And thanks again to our wonderful technical support here at Tübingen. It is my pleasure to present to you this afternoon here in Germany and this morning here in North America and Central America, Dr. Raul Pacheco-Vega, who is associate professor in the Methods Lab in the Latin American Facility for Social Sciences. We are delighted with the choice of Raul because he is somebody who is really, truly interdisciplinary. And so I think he will be able to say in this keynote, which we will hope it will be of interest and nourish and feed into all of the workshops and discussions you'll be having over the next day or so. He is coming from a background of political science, from geography. He uses qualitative methods with a particular focus on ethnography. So I think he's coming from a background that will be very pertinent to our discussions. Just some more brief details about Raul. He is a specialist in comparative public policy. He focuses on environmental policies, solid waste management, water governance, urban restructuring, transnational environmental social movements, and experimental methods in public policy, just to name a few of his research areas. He is currently working on a program looking at spatial, political, and human dimensions of public service in a comparative perspective. And he's a prolific member of editorial boards and journals. I'll just mention a few. He was associate editor of the International Journal of Qualitative Methods and is associate editor of the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences. He's also on the editorial boards of several other journals, including the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis, Politics and Space, Politics, Groups and Identity. Raul is also a national research level 1 researcher for the Mexican National Researchers System. I'm assuming that some of you are familiar with Raul's work because he is a very prolific social media personage as well. For those of you who aren't familiar with Raul's work, I would strongly encourage you to have a look at his blog, which can be found on his website just by Googling Raul Pacheco. There he has over the years, over the months, he's been providing really very pertinent, insightful contributions on such things as note-taking, getting published, grant writing, and general organization of your life as an academic scholar. I think those of you who I've spoken to about his site confirm that it is a wonderful resource. So Raul, from my own side and those from other people who I know have used it, thank you for that. It is invaluable. Finally, when we decided to consider inviting Raul this afternoon, we were sure that he would have something to contribute to all the workshops. And we were then even more delighted when he came back with a proposition for this discussion, this keynote this afternoon on writing about vulnerable populations. The question of how we represent the people we research alongside is an issue, a dilemma for all in social sciences. And at this moment, I think this question of vulnerability is perhaps ever more pressing. I think about Deserto, who was writing in 1984 that marginality today is no longer limited to minority groups, but is rather massive and persuasive. And I think since 1984 to the common period, the question of vulnerability cannot be sidelined at all. So, Raul, we are very impatient to hear what you have to say, and we look forward to the discussions that will follow. I pass over to you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you so much to everybody who invited me. Thank you to Tübingen University. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you so much for this kind introduction and for inviting me to give a keynote speech to the University of Tübingen Summer School on Academic Writing. It is my great honor to be here, and I wish to have done this talk in person. Hopefully next year I will get invited back, and I'm thrilled to be speaking to you via Zoom right now. And I'm also extremely grateful that the University of Tübingen has also kindly agreed to make my talk available urbi et orbi via YouTube. So thank you, Claire, for making all of this possible. I'm going to share my screen now because I have a few slides that I would like to share with you. And if you are on Twitter, as Claire mentioned, at Raul Pacheco is my Twitter ID. And should you desire to live tweet portions of my talk, you can do so using the following format, which is the quotation, then my Twitter ID, and then the hashtag RPVQualWriting, which I assume will be obvious to you all. It's Raul Pacheco-Vega, qualitative writing. To be a good writer, you not only have to write a great deal, but you have to care. You do not have to have a complicated moral philosophy, but a writer always tries, I think, to be a part of the solution, to understand a little about life and to pass it on. The passage I quoted is by Anne Lamott, one of the greatest writers and someone who also thinks very deeply about writing. Her point in this quote resonates with the core reason why I chose to give a keynote talk about writing qualitative research that focuses on vulnerable or marginalized communities. I care very, very deeply. I have cared from a very young age. I have spent the better life of my life working with communities and individuals at the margins. As a 13-year-old child, I convinced my local office of the Mexican National Institute for Adults to allow me to undertake a volunteering program teaching basic literacy skills, arithmetic, and reading writing to adults in gang-riddled neighborhoods in León, in the central Mexican state of Guanajuato. I was educated in both Jesuit and Lasallian institutions and raised to do volunteer literacy work in remote locations in Mexico. I have spent most of my academic career post-PhD studying the conditions under which individuals cooperate for robust natural resource governance. I am a scholar of comparative public policy with multidisciplinary training and a broad range of research interests. My work is theoretically informed by primarily empirically based and field-based. As a result, I have undertaken fieldwork in multiple cities across a relatively large number of countries, studying water insecurity, informal waste picking, toilet insecurity, and lately homelessness and rough sleeping, and public policies aimed at protecting older people. While I am known as a mixed methods scholar, I have also been the editor for the Americas of the International Journal of Qualitative Methods. And much of my work uses a broad range of ethnographic approaches, including comparative and multi-sided ethnography. My positionality is also very well known and transpires through my scholarship. I'm a researcher who is deeply interested in understanding intractable social problems that affect individuals at the margins and increase their vulnerability to multiple stressors. As a result, I study comparative public policy problems where my goal is to shrink the gap between the rich and the poor, and protect and empower those at the margins and those most vulnerable. My work is informed by an ethics of protecting the vulnerable while researching the vulnerable. As you can see, I'm multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary because my work crosses from chemical engineering, which is my undergrad, economics, which is my master's, and then I have a double PhD in human geography and political science. I am well aware of the various debates on whether individuals, whether subjects of research projects or the population at large, agree with being considered vulnerable. My own view is that vulnerability is a relational property. Individuals are vulnerable to something. Households who live in coastal zones are vulnerable to rising sea levels, as well as abrupt climatic change that could lead to flooding. I view vulnerability as intrinsic, which is an inherent property of individuals, communities, and locations, or produced, the result of systemic oppression, environmental injustice, etc. So Given the relational property of vulnerability when doing reflexive work, we ought to consider the relative positionality of the researcher vis-a-vis the research community. Hence why I say the vulnerable communities. These communities and subjects can be vulnerable to even our own presence as researchers. I do agree, it can be seen as a vague or unwelcome descriptor, but I use it here as a shorthand for individuals and communities at the margins and at risk. Doing research with and about elites is very different from studying marginalized people. This is one of the reasons why I make this distinction. I have undertaken extensive ethnographic work at both ends of the spectrum and can recognize the stark differences across both groups very well. For the purposes of this keynote, I'm interested in discussing solely the latter without contrasting with the former. As you can see on the screen shows a comparative discussion of two of my major projects. One is on the comparative politics of informal way speaking, which intends to bring informal way speakers into the discussion because it broadens the conversations, shifting our views from technological choice, how do we properly dispose of waste, to examining policy and societal choice, how do we involve all members of society in how waste streams are managed. My project on the study of transnational environmental NGO coalitions intended to understand NGO strategies through two main pathways. The first one is through transnational advocacy networks as influencers and transnational environmental non-governmental organization coalition building as a pressure strategy, which is basically naming and shaming. As I mentioned, my interviewees and participants in the informal way speakers are marginalized, disadvantaged, and undertaking survival economies. So it is challenging for them it is difficult for them to challenge government officials. However, my NGO project is a study of elites. Major NGO heads participate in North American Environmental Commission for Environmental Cooperations meetings. So facing government officials is for them a piece of cake. For my informal way speakers project, I use a comparative ethnography approach, whereas for my transnational environmental NGO coalitions, I have used longitudinal ethnography and qualitative longitudinal research, QLR. Obviously, the ethical concerns are different. For informal way speakers, I'm concerned about further marginalization, stigmatization, and the reification of a weaker position. Whereas for my transnational NGO coalitions, I'm interested in ethical concerns of weakening of elite positions or potentially regulatory capture. So the goal of my talk is to probe and ask tough questions on how we can write qualitative research that examines vulnerable populations. I purport to elucidate several challenges and opportunities that emerge from this type of writing. Deciding on the topic of this keynote was not an easy project. Writing is hard. Writing up qualitative research is harder, and writing qualitative research that focuses on vulnerable or marginalized communities is much, much harder. These multiple layers of complexity and difficulty reveal themselves once we try to navigate the ethics and logistics of fieldwork in settings where communities and individuals may very well further marginalized or render vulnerable through our own research. How do we report research on communities and individuals who have been historically marginalized and without reproducing the same factors that have hindered their progress? How do we properly give voice, or better yet, raise the voices of those at the margins without drowning them with our own? What can we do to make our writing a tool for empowerment rather than an instrument of oppression? I wish I had all the answers. What I can promise with this talk is that I will ask probing questions and offer a few points of considerations. I do ask that you help me think through this challenging topic and help me make sense of the vast literature on the ethics of researching vulnerable communities and its intersections with scholarship on how to write up qualitative work. One of the ways in which I make sense of this complex topic is by thinking about how and why we use qualitative methods for the study of social problems. While the debate between qualitative and quantitative camps is far from over, I believe that it is really overwrought. I use both types of methods in my own research, and one way in which I'm making sense of how I teach them when I impart my mixed methods course is through thinking about the different types of validities, and I am grateful to Dr. Daniel Casino for reminding me of this. We frequently use quantitative research to increase external validity, to generalize, to discern broad patterns and assess whether they're generalizable. We often undertake qualitative investigations to increase internal validity, to make sense of the world and ensure that our interpretation of it is actually accurate, to understand a phenomenon in depth. I use qualitative methods to make sense of the world and of the social problems I'm interested in research. These are most suitable to studies that employ field-based, extensive, in-depth engagements. For the better part of 20 years, I have employed various types of ethnographic approaches, including comparative ethnography, multi-site ethnography, and rapid ethnographic assessments. Perhaps the most important consideration I had in mind when thinking about this topic was the notion of writing with communities rather than about communities. And the logic that helped me reach this conclusion will be clearer as I progress through the keynote. I will use a three-pronged question-based approach to consider the question: how do we should we consider writing qualitative research about vulnerable communities? My first set of questions would be, should we undertake this qualitative research project? In fact, should we do this project at all? Who am I to engage in this research? For these and the remaining questions, I will draw from my personal experience and my own thinking about whether or not to engage in a particular research project. I began studying homelessness in earnest about 3 years ago because the publication of my article with Dr. Kate Pariseau, Doubly Engaged Ethnography, made me reflect on other types of vulnerable populations: individuals deprived of their freedom, people experiencing homelessness, and LGBTQ+ communities, for example. All of these identities can at some point intersect, and therefore we ought to consider how these individuals perceive and experience multiple barriers to welfare and well-being. In my fieldwork across 13 cities and 8 countries, I found that a number of informal way speakers experience homelessness and therefore engage in what's often called the survival economy. Understanding the comparative politics of informal way speaking, therefore, required me also to seek to comprehend the livelihoods of recyclers, including their housing situation, which I often found was precarious. I undertook an in-depth review of the literature on homelessness in Mexico and found a very scant body of words. I thought to myself, if not me, then who? If not now, then when? One of my graduate students, Fausto Amador, is about to complete his master's thesis on the topic of at risk of homelessness youth in Mexico, and I feel like the entirety of my project has literally found its justification. We need a more in-depth understanding of homelessness in Mexico because we need to render these people visible. Their invisibility to society, to policymakers, to scholars is enraging and maddening. Remaining invisible makes them even more vulnerable to multiple negative contextual factors. I want to change that. I want to help individuals experiencing homelessness in Mexico be visible to policymakers and society, and therefore I am even more adamant about researching and writing about them. My second set of questions would be, given that we've engaged in this research project, what kind of questions should we ask? And once we analyze and synthesize the research, how should we write about these communities? What kinds of protections can we engage in when writing about vulnerable individuals and groups that can serve as shields rather than instruments of further stigmatization, precarization, or vulnerability? I believe that a large portion of the answers to these questions will center around the agency of these communities. As the models of participatory and engaged research evolve, so will our writing approaches. And we will need to think about and engage in writing with communities rather than about communities. To protect individuals, we will need to go beyond the traditional, and now, I believe, somewhat dated model of arm's length research. If we really want to undertake meaningful research, what Pacheco-Vega and Paris defined as doubly engaged ethnography, we need to consider our positionality, reflexivity, and our positions as insiders and outsiders. We ought to make sure that our research is responsive to science and society, but also to the communities we care about, study, and engage with. In my work with informal way speakers, I follow usual IRB protections. I anonymize, protect informants, ask for informal consents, but I also share the results of my research with them. As an anecdote, I will share that oftentimes during my fieldwork, I will discuss variation in the price of cardboard across different cities and engage with my informants to help me understand the factors that influence this variation. No later than yesterday, I was discussing the price of plastic in León and Aguascalientes, another city that is nearby to where I am right now, which is in León, and the city where I live. So I do discuss the prices, and in sharing this information, I also try to do so in a way to empower those that I study as well. My third set of questions centers around the issue of vulnerability and how we should write up qualitative research results. I have often mentioned how fieldwork around impoverished individuals and marginalized communities, often lacking access to water or toilets, is painful to me. But I do not seek to center this keynote around me and my experience. Nevertheless, when thinking about the core topic, vulnerable communities, I also thought about the work of the incomparable Ruth Behar and her book, The Vulnerable Researcher. The subtitle of her book is Anthropology That Breaks Your Heart. And I would ask this audience to consider my third set of questions. How can a researcher be protective of the communities and individuals they're interested in? And what does researchers' vulnerability help us achieve? In this sense, in my own work, I flip the traditional script. I frequently don't think of myself as the empowered scholar who will protect communities, but I open myself up vulnerably, and I share my own identities with these individuals in a way that I believe levels the playing field and helps me set common ground. I am an openly gay Latino scholar who, despite being educated in the global north, because I did my PhD at the University of British Columbia, works in an institution in the global south, Flaxon, Mexico. Sharing these intersectional identities has helped me break ground when engaging with marginalized individuals and communities. I render myself vulnerable, and in doing so, I also explain why I feel so passionate about researching the topics that I do and the importance that I engage in. This approach has yielded good results, and I believe it has been helpful in ensuring that my research is non-extractive and it is more engaged with the communities I'm interested in. Few things make me feel as much physical and emotional pain as witnessing poverty. Living in a country where street corners are heavily populated by panhandlers, candy sellers, squeegee car shield cleaners, many of them extraordinarily young and small children, makes it really hard to avoid witnessing poverty. And yet these same populations are invisible to policymakers and frequently invisibilized by the general public. People drive in their cars and pass these individuals by more often than not without offering a coin or even so much as a word of encouragement or a thank you. This angers me and fuels my drive to understand the factors that drive the lack of proper public policies to help these individuals at the margins of society. As I progressed through the keynote, I realized how much of the thinking I've done about writing up qualitative research that focuses on vulnerable communities has taken a life cycle approach, which I also teach my graduate students, thesis writers, and research assistants. We ought to make considerations about the design of a research project beforehand, during, and after completing the project. All projects have a life cycle, but communities don't. Communities remain on site for years and even decades after a research team have left. We can't just enter extractive research and leave. This is wrong, and this is extractive, and this is the kind of research that I'm hoping I will encourage participants in this keynote, but also anybody who is listening also through YouTube and the other means, to consider that research should not be extracted, but should also be done in co-production with communities. Let me bring this keynote to a close by reminding us of the importance of ethics in qualitative research. Over the past few years, I have taught qualitative methods this fall. I have taught mixed methods, historical methods, research design, and will teach qualitative methods this fall. And the one thing that I emphasize to my students is that all social science research needs to consider ethics first and foremost. Undertaking research that is deeply engaged with the local community and local culture and communities, writing with communities and not about them, ensuring that we use intersectional analytical lenses and finding ways to make our research not only legible, but usable for the communities, avoiding extractivism in social science research, protecting the vulnerable while researching the vulnerable. Researching the vulnerable has multiple configurations and offers a broad range of challenges, not only ethical, but also logistical. Underlying a key, honest, and truthful interest in bettering the lives of those who study, we can also find a certain degree of naivete in social science researchers. Who are we to intrude in the homes and communities of individuals living at the margins? What is our responsibility to our subjects? There is no easy answer, and I cannot suggest that my approach is the best, but it is one that helps me set an ethical and operational framework for how I work when I study vulnerable and marginalized populations. A large portion of what drives my own work is a keen interest in bridging the gap between the rich and the poor. I am keenly aware of the inequalities plaguing our society, and I do research that focuses on protecting vulnerable communities. Even if I study environmental politics or homelessness policy, my ultimate goal is improving societal welfare, particularly for marginalized individuals, and rendering the invisible visible. I believe we owe it to traditionally, structurally vulnerable communities to make the issues they are affected by visible and legible to politicians and policymakers. It is part of our responsibility in writing up qualitative research about vulnerable populations. I want to express gratitude to all participants in my research projects, co-authors, collaborators, co-PAs, my students, and my research assistants, Dr. Claire Bullen, obviously, for the invitation, and for extensive reflection on these issues to Drs. Kate Parisot, Farhana Sultana, Amber Woodich, and Marcela Torres-Bon, with whom I have had a lot of discussions around these issues. Also respondents to a question that I did on Twitter. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Raul. Thank you very much. That was very stimulating and a very important food for reflection that you've given us there. And I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of questions. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit technologically traumatized by this responsibility for co-hosting this YouTube Live. So I'm not quite sure how people from YouTube can ask questions, but we would encourage you to participate in this debate. I think by posting questions, Raul,
yeah.
You're much more.
They can post questions on the YouTube. If you have enabled questions in the chat, they can write on the chat. They can write on the live chat as well. And somebody can monitor. My computer is unfortunately low on resources, so I don't think I can monitor them, but I do have my phone, and I can also try to check on my phone if there are any questions as well. I would also encourage participants to ask questions here that we would definitely follow up on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully most of you are now familiar with how this works, and we encourage you to write messages in the chat, or you can indicate with a yellow hands up sign if you would like to speak to Raul directly. Any questions for anybody while we are straight away, while people are deliberating and collecting their thoughts? I have something I would like to ask to kick. Okay, I can ask something to kick off, and then Monica, I've got the first question coming here. Well, I'll pass over to you, Monica or Hirabzar. Would you like to start the debate? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your talk and also the insight into your own ethnographic research, which I find very interesting. Mike, I have actually two questions. One is related to how you define a group to be vulnerable. I mean, the examples that you gave were so self-evident, but these might not be the only examples, and there might be examples which make the situation a little more complicated. For example, if you research, like, let's say, right-wing groups or violent groups, they might be vulnerable in terms of facing potentially criminal persecution, right? So you get into a difficult situation. Would you nevertheless consider these vulnerable groups, and would for these groups, like, would you claim the same like consequences for your research, for your research ethics, or wouldn't you consider them being vulnerable, or would you just not do research with these kinds of groups? And the second question is, so you distinguish between different types of vulnerability, but I think there is also, like, I would add a third type of vulnerability, like a claimed vulnerability. So I guess we all experience situations where groups of different kinds or individuals of different kinds claim vulnerability for themselves and ask for, like, being treated in a certain way because of that. And you might, like, agree with that, or you might not agree with that. Like not being confronted with certain literature because they feel like threatened by that or whatever. So how do you, is that something you experience as well, or has that come up as a problem in your research as well, that we are facing in certain situations and maybe also in certain milieus, like a competition over vulnerability of different kinds, where things might not be as clear-cut as in the examples that you gave, dealing with homelessness or dealing with poor groups, where you can easily say, or I mean, not easily, like de facto, but like on a systematic level, that it is an aim for research to bridge a gap between the rich and the poor. Thank you.
Claire, would you like me to take a few questions and then I can answer? If you want, you can go with the next one.
However you wish to play it. Would you like to take?
I've written Monica's questions, so I'm happy to take a few and then go over them.
Okay. I can't see if we've got any questions in the chat, so I'll just start off with my own question. And I was thinking about your lifestyle approach to research and how, as researchers, we can ethically engage with the communities before and afterwards. And I wanted to go back to your question about the vulnerable researcher. And I know that many of us who are in postgraduate, postdoctoral researchers or researchers on contracts or with too much work to do, or not short-term funding contracts, can feel it very difficult to be respectful of our communities because we don't have the capacity to follow through in a completely ethical approach. I know that I had a one-year postdoctoral fellowship. I had to go to Algeria and come back again, and it was impossible to maintain relations with the people I was researching after completing because of funding. And so as a vulnerable researcher, I think we feel often very guilty about our inability to be ethical about the way in which we do research, which perhaps challenges our, or makes us doubtful about whether we should be doing it or not. And I think there's a lot of young researchers who have those existential crises. So any thoughts you have on that would be really interesting.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Monica and Claire. So I'm going to take the second question, if that's okay with everybody, instead of the first one. So and then I can move on to the first one. So I would argue that as long as a researcher is open with the community about their resources, right? Like, if you are on a 2-year postdoc, you may not have the possibility, as I have done, of studying a group for a decade. This is not this. So I think honesty is particularly helpful. I'm very honest with different. So the one I've done research in 8 countries and 13 cities, and the country where I've done the least amount of time has been Japan. And I studied waste picking in Japan. And I have done it over 2 periods of time, twice over the last 10 years. One was in 2013 and the other one was in 2017. And I spent a month, but still a month is not enough. This is what is called rapid ethnographic assessment. And I was honest from the get-go. And I said, I don't have the time to really be here for a year. I would love to. I speak enough Japanese that I can try to live in Japan, but I don't have the resources. I have to go back to my own country. So I believe being honest is the first way. On to Monica's questions, and all of these are excellent questions. Thank you, Claire and Monica. On the vulnerability issue, I believe that vulnerability, because it's relational, I always think about it as a power imbalance, right? So would a right-wing group have a power imbalance with regards to me as a researcher? Possibly, it really depends. I have not studied right-wing groups. I do know of some studies, some ethnographic work on right-wing groups, and it's very likely that these groups felt vulnerable because they're possibly seen as, too extreme. I do think that this is why the term vulnerable is contentious, right? So some people prefer to say, well, I study marginalized communities, and communities at the margins include those who are at the margins financially, economically, but also, if you think about it, right-wing groups could also be marginalized if you think about, the mainstream being, I don't know, democratic people who are Democrats or, liberals and right in the middle, right? So this is a really interesting question. I wish I had the perfect answer, but I think when I think about groups that are vulnerable, I think mostly as power imbalances, and power imbalances that would potentially yield a negative result, a negative outcome once they engage in my project. So that's what I would think about. The claim vulnerability, I have not come across competing vulnerabilities, but it's really interesting that you mentioned this, because when I asked questions on Twitter, how do you think I should think about these issues? A number of researchers said to me, well, I don't know if people like being called vulnerable. And it's interesting because I have studied older people's policies and homelessness policies, and I don't think I have actually ever, when I share my insights, I have never mentioned, these are insights about vulnerable communities. I mentioned these are usually issues that appear in communities at the margins of traditional societal work. So that helps me sort of establish a dialogue where there's not these competing definitions of vulnerability. But it's an excellent question, and one that will help me improve this keynote. I'm hoping to publish this keynote as a journal article. So this will be an excellent question to think about. Thank you so much. So Damian and Vanessa, if you would like to go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Raul. It was a real pleasure to see you here, even if it was virtually. I've been following your work not only through Twitter, but also through your blog, and it's been really inspiring. And I also wanted to say directly thanks for that. You are really sharing a lot of insights that are also helping our students, which I also like to use for the students, and they really like the ASE method, which is something different than the talk today, but this is a reading strategy which works very well. But I wanted to go to the question connected to this talk, which is connected to the concept of epistemic partner, which I have learned a couple of years ago. I have done two long-term ethnography projects. One was in Murcia, in a city in Spain where I was living from before moving to Germany, and then going back to that city as a researcher. And at the time, I had a kind of a rather positivistic idea of ethnography, and I thought I had to keep distance from the people I was studying with and so on. But then I had a change. Now I'm doing research in Santiago de Chile with vulnerable populations. And for me, doing collaborative research was not only, it was actually especially a condition at first, because the communities I was engaging with, they were actually also aware of epistemic extractivism, and they were very clear, what are you going to do for us if we are going to do this for you? And that really made me think a lot in how to approach ethnography in a different way, in a way that challenged my previous way of thinking about ethnography. And now I'm trying to do kind of to think collaboratively and to try to create knowledge collaboratively. One of the things we are doing is we are doing the research now via Zoom in most of the cases at the moment. And we are doing a workshop in which a local assistant, a local researcher, he is actually teaching a workshop on how to do community videos. And being part of that, and the idea is that we are going to create a collective story about the community that we are that the project is part of. So we are somehow giving something back, and we are also kind of co-producing. I think that is great, and that challenges my previous way of thinking. Previous, I mean like 8 years ago, maybe. And I think also in epistemological terms, you might say, okay, if you are co-producing the knowledge with the people, how can you get an analytical distance from that? So I just wanted you maybe to reflect on that and to give a couple of examples of how you co-produce knowledge with the local community.
Thank you, Damian. Vanessa, and then I can respond to this next round.
Okay, thank you for your talk and also for the discussion right now. So I already got a better insight on what you think vulnerability is, but what I would like to know is you were talking about care as an ethics of research, and then you spoke about the protecting the vulnerable while researching them. And I have the impression that there is, I don't know really how to say that. It's in conflict, those two, because I have, I would say protecting is some sort of maybe patriarchal, coming from top down way of seeing the vulnerable and exploiting this power imbalance. And care would be just the other way around, or not really the other way around, but maybe something more in dialogue. So maybe you could explain this a bit more so that I get the difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Damian and Vanessa. These are fantastic questions. When I teach ethnography, Damian, I came to, so think about the way in which I was raised, right? Like I'm a chemical engineer, so I believe in the reaction between, hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide, which gives me water and salt. So there's a reality, and I was raised positivistic, and all of my dissertations, my thesis, undergrad, master's, and PhD were quantitative. So I was very sure that there was. So I came to ethnography in the same way as you did. I was hearing you, and I was like, that is exactly how I came into ethnography. I was, very positivistic, and people thought, traditional qualitative researchers would say to me, how can you look at ethnography, positivistically? And I'm like, well, there's a reality. I embed myself in the reality. I'm an observant, and I observe the reality, and I spend years observing that reality, and then I write it up, and I take a distance. But then, as you mentioned, the same happened to me as I progressed in my research. I realized exactly what Vanessa is mentioning, right? Like there's this power imbalance, this sort of patriarchal, top-down, explaining exploitative relationships. So I thought about how can I get this kind of work to occur in this epistemic partner collaborative research. I have not reached the point where I do participatory action research that, for example, one thing that I would love to do would be to offer, individuals experiencing homelessness phones so that they could journal, or even, notebooks so they could journal. How is your experience of living on the street and so on? I have not done it. I often think about storytelling as a powerful tool. I haven't done it yet. I'm still in the process. I'm at the point where I share my research with my subjects, and that's sort of part of the co-productive component. I'm not there at the point of co-producing the research design, which I think it's the next stage of doing this work. I'm hoping to do that with homelessness, and I'm also hoping to do that with in Mexico, care homes are called asilos, and I'm gonna try to do some of these work, sort of, raising the voices of those who, people. Care work traditionally is outsourced to families. This is a problem of public policy, and therefore, one of the ways in which I want to highlight this is, by letting these individuals and these people living in care homes tell their own stories using storytelling strategies. But these stories need also to be told if they're need to be told with the team of researchers. So I have my grad students, and I'm hoping to do to have a few of them do their thesis on this. So I haven't done yet the co-production. I'm moving in that direction. That's the direction I'm moving on. But I am at the co-sharing of work. Now, with regards to Vanessa's question on whether there is conflict on protecting the vulnerable while researching the vulnerable. So, and that's why I cited Robert Gooding. Robert Gooding is a political theorist who says that the government is a duty. So the duty of the government is to protect the vulnerable. So the government public policies are not supposed to be for the elites. They're supposed to be for those who are at the margins and who are less well off. So that's his approach. And I also cited Pranee Liamputong, Professor Pranee Liamputong, and Professor Liamputong, she says, researching the vulnerable can be done if you are sort of interested in doing this kind of work to really put the well-being of the researched at the same level or above anything else, right? So in this sense, that's why I combined both the Gooding and the Liamputong approach, right? Like it's an approach where I study public policy problems where the duty of the government is to protect the vulnerable. And I, as a researcher, I aim to follow, Liamputong and other scholars, even my own work on doubling edge ethnography, to push for an ethic of caring about the community. And in caring about the community, we need to also listen to the community. And this is also a question I grapple with. Am I supposed to be, I'm a person who is well housed. I have a house and I have permanent housing. Am I supposed to be the one researching, unhoused people experiencing homelessness? And the problem is that I don't see anybody else taking on the baton. So that's, I sometimes research topics, not because I believe I'm particularly competent, but I'm particularly enraged by the lack of research. And this is, I believe I have a duty. And that's also this duty of care also pushes me to write my blog and to write my Twitter threads and so on. I mean, if I don't share these, writing strategies, then who does? Like there's this terrible like, if I told you how many thousands of people read my blog and how many people read my work, hoping to find guidelines on how to do research, how to read, how to do read reviews, I do it because I feel this duty, right? I do the same thing with vulnerable populations. I would be extraordinarily presumptuous to believe that I'm the right person to research a topic, but I'm just enraged and I'm just angry at the fact that the governments that I engage with, and I did my sabbatical in France, and I was devastated by the marginalization that I witnessed in France. And and France is a first world country, right? Like it's one of the richest countries, and I was enraged, and that's why I feel so drawn to topics like water insecurity and toilet insecurity. I can't believe that more people are not taking on these issues. There are a number of people taking on these issues, but ethnographically, there are very few, and I'm one of them, and I do it because I'm angry. And I think this makes me also be honest with you all. I mean, as a researcher, I get angry and I get disappointed at governments. And sometimes I do these projects because I believe that I have a duty and that I have a duty to society.
I think, Raul, thank you very much for your rich comments to the very stimulating questions we've had. And I think this debate just shows the high importance of the subject that you discussed and raised with us, and the complexity. We're not going to be finding an easy solution, unfortunately. But this builds on reflections and thinking that we've been trying to develop here with these keynotes. Before you, the last keynote we had was on reflexivity and the multiple reflexivities by John Dean, the importance to reflect on our own positionality, representation, and disciplinary positions, and how that influences the way in which we can engage respectfully and in important, truthful and empowering ways with the people we're researching alongside and with. I've got a lot to take away and digest from that. Hopefully, the workshop participants will have time over the next few days, next few hours, to take some of your ideas and work with them and pull them apart more deeply. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for your amazing questions. I'm extraordinarily grateful. This is the first time I actually have done this talk, so I'm extraordinarily grateful that you have shared these wonderful questions. And I would like to just say, if you are on Twitter, I'm posting my Twitter on the chat, and my blog is also posted on the chat. So I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to this keynote, and thank you also for allowing the keynote to be live streamed. I think it is important that we share our knowledge with the world. I was mentored by the late Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize, and by her husband, also the late Vincent Ostrom. And their work on the commons, and particularly the knowledge commons, is incredible. And they, I'm very grateful that this will be a resource for other qualitative researchers around the world to think about and reflect about the issues surrounding qualitative research on vulnerable communities and their writing issues as well. So thank you very much for also allowing for the live stream. Thank you so much.
So now to wrap up, I would like to conclude this session. The student workshops, the workshops will be taking place at 2:30. So we incite all of those who are to be participating to take care of yourselves. Go and get a drink or refreshments and come back and join your workshops at 2:30. I can see Jörg, you want
to... just a little add-on to this, more technical hint. Please note that we have kind of an open Zoom session after the workshop. So if you still feel able to sit in front of a computer screen, and if you like to socialize with some of the other participants, maybe also from the other groups, we will open up some of these breakout sessions, escape rooms, whatever you call them, and you can sit and have your own wine or your own beer and talk with the others into the evening. And also we have a similar thing tomorrow in the morning before the sessions, the workshops start, so you can socialize with others while having your muesli or your bagel or whatsoever. And talk about your experiences from today, and then start freshly in your workshop. So just to don't miss these social components of the workshop organization. Okay, so then have fun in your workshops. I very much appreciate you all were here to listen to Raul, and thanks again to Raul for his talk. Until later, bye.
Thank you. Claire, you may want to stop the streaming as well onto YouTube. Damian, thank you so much. Oh, I think it's streaming again, so maybe...
My pleasure.